So we can all go home and tonight?
Work with Frank Edgar against him?
He just sat and growled.
Right.
But he didn't, at the end, he didn't file
Okay, I think, oh, there goes Cliff. He'll be right back. But we're all here. What we're going to do is have Rick and Sarah and Marcus go through their presentations, and then we'll have questions at the end. We're going to aim still for a 9:30 end, but we can maybe go 15 minutes longer. I don't think any of us will turn into a pumpkin, but we will at 10 o'clock for sure. So if we go over, it's only a few minutes. Okay, so...
Wait 1 second, or do they decide to go out and eat while we talk now?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's wait until Cliff gets back in here. And there's Ray. Okay. Go right ahead, Rick.
Okay. It's been an interesting conversation. At the end of the last talk, we talked a little bit about mixed use and the role of having a variety of uses in the development. And housing does have a role to play in sustainability and sustainable development. Transportation is a big chunk of the energy consumption, air quality standards. It's a big part of our financial budgets to anybody's house. And you all live in a really wonderful small town, and I bet you that 95% of the people that go to work outside of the town probably get in the car every day and go to work. So having additional transportation access will be a wonderful thing as Caltrain continues to develop, and possibly even the light rail from San Francisco could even move farther down the Bay Shore. All of those accessibility elements would be important. We started, there's been a lot of talk about sustainable buildings, but I thought I'd think about this as a sustainable community. I'm assuming that at some point you all will reach a decision on the type of community you want, and then once you've reached that decision, you'll actually want to see it implemented over time. And I've worked on a number of plans that are very similar in scale. And there are many communities throughout the Bay Area that are grappling, as we mentioned at the onset, about the same issues that you all are grappling with: community identity, a sense of change, these very large developments happening in their community or adjacent to their community. And communities are also changing 30-year policies where they've had no housing allowed policies in big segments of their community, that they're now actually shifting those policies over time because they're trying to create a more well-rounded community for them in the future. And it's not just for them, it's really for their kids and for the rest of the community. So a few slides with words, and then we'll get off of that. Competition, assuming, and I'm making a big assumption, but assuming that you actually would like to see the final plan that you all approve be realized, part of that is that your community is going to be in great competition with a wide variety of other communities up and down the Bay and throughout the Bay Area. Because every city, there's been lots of development for employment that's happened, not a lot of housing over a long period of time. And that's been specifically what the communities have asked for. Now, that hasn't actually reduced traffic congestion over the last 30 years in the Bay Area. Clearly, it hasn't, having no less residential development hasn't reduced traffic. But today, communities are really competing for employment, and they're they want a specific kind of employment. They're looking for specialized technological businesses, unique businesses, identity, new technologies, and not looking at all the types of employment that have traditionally been seen in the past. And businesses within these communities are really competing for those top employees. And if you've talked to your kids recently, and my son is in college and he's looking at where he's going to live when he gets out of school and his employment, they want something very different, I think, than many other people wanted over time. But they really want a place where they work and where they live to be exciting. They want to live in a dynamic community that is really unique, and half of their kids don't even want to drive a car. So that's really important. So now businesses are chasing employees, and they're wanting to locate in an environment which attracts those top employees. And so everybody's in competition, and it's a group to see who can get the best people in the best places, in the best communities. And I think you have a good step forward because you do have a community identity, and you want to retain that. But if you can enhance that and create a more special place, I think that will be of a real benefit. But many people are dealing with this over time and have dealt with it. But you're going to be competing against a wide variety of communities throughout the Bay Area for those employment uses that you are looking to have within this development area. There's the Candlestick community that's right across the street, or right across 101. South San Francisco has been very successful at attracting employment over time. It's changing dramatically now, but one of the things they're doing is they're providing a substantial amount of housing now in their downtown. San Bruno, I'm literally going to a meeting Monday where they're looking at an employment center and placing housing in it for the first time in an extended period of time. Redwood City's downtown. The North Bay Shore is looking at 10,000 units being put around the Google campuses, substantially at Google's request, to both take the pressure off the existing community and to provide a more dynamic community for their employees. South Fremont has done it. Out in Pleasanton, Hacienda Business Park is transforming. And even way out in North Concord, these areas are all looking at creating new, dynamic, diverse communities that are at the scale of the development that you are looking at within your community. Now, you have a very small community currently, but this is not a unique conversation that everyone is having. Even within Candlestick Point and Hunters Point, a very small portion of that is actually real substantially employment uses. And you can get a lot of employment in a very small footprint within your community. So that is the one that's closest to you that you're going to be competing directly for or against for those employment uses. And so when people decide where to locate their business, they want to be close to transit because they want to be able to get their employees there. They want housing around it so that their employees can walk to work or bike to work. They want open space and amenities around it. They want retail for their employees to be able to use, unless they're going to provide it all internally, which is what the office parks around the Google campus have done previously, because it wasn't provided by the community, because it can't all be supported by employment only. In downtown South San Francisco, you've seen developments that are starting to go under construction right along the freeway, which are housing developments. That was a very particular strategy that the city had to provide additional housing to enhance their downtown and to provide the housing that that the employers were saying they needed for their employees, and also to reduce vehicle trips into their office park, because they, similar to all the other office parks, have limited access. Mountain View's the toughest example. Limited access. TDM is stretched to the max. Currently, they're getting 35% reduction in trips. They're running buses. They're doing it as private transit versus public transit. And what they're trying to do is create additional housing within the community that will both enhance their downtown and get their businesses to be more successful. And they're also wanting to create, to be able to retain those employers and those businesses in their campus. And they're starting to move housing over to the other side of the freeway for the first time ever. In the North Bay Shore and Mountain View, we're completing a community plan that's going to the council to vote, which is going to allow for approximately 10,000 units of housing. It's focused on housing for both employees and businesses in the North Bay Shore area. They're trying to reduce the vehicle trips into the area by providing more housing there and using the exit capacity of those residents so that when they leave the area, they actually can provide better services in the area, and the residents that leave that go to work someplace else can use the excess capacity on the way out that others would use on the way in. So they want to create a dynamic, unique, new community within the North Bay Shore. This is after 30 years of not allowing housing to be allowed in the area. And the last city council voted no housing in the general plan, and that city council was removed at the last election, and the new city council has listened to the community and voted for this new land use strategy within the North Bay Shore area. In South Fremont, this is right next to Tesla. So lots of new innovative, it's a new innovation district as they're touting it. They have 800 plus acres. They wanted to provide, as they had for a policy of 30 to 40 years, no residential within this area. The ULI, Urban Land Institute, and a variety of other land use specialists and economic specialists throughout the United States came down to them and said, what do you mean you're creating an employment center that doesn't have any residential development in it? You need the residential development to attract the commercial development that you're touting, because nobody wants to just live in a place that's only open from 9 to 5. And nobody wants to work in a place like that. So the office park is changing. They have suggested in this 800 acres that they can get millions and millions and millions of square feet of employment uses, but they've also incorporated 4,000 units of housing that will really begin to activate, and the employment center is going to chase the employees that are also living in the community as well. But you also need to get the things that you want to get out of that. And that community has very high standards for their schools. They're impacted. So to actually allow, in part of the community plan process, instead of just saying, well, we'll deal with it later, the deal was made between the landowners, the city, the school district, to actually build a new school. It's a turnkey project. It's not giving the school district the money and doing it. They're literally building the school and a park in the center of the facility so that they will have the ability to keep the pressure off the existing school system. And that was something that the community asked for very specifically, and it was something that the development community factored in. So again, this is an issue of asking for certain things that the community wants and make sure that you tie those to the overall development. So you can only build a certain number of units within the community before you have to have the school up and running. North Concord is a very large development also, 860 acres. They are looking at about 5,700 units. They're also going to have millions of square feet of commercial office space and retail development as well. It's at one of the BART stations, and the transportation is really focused on getting employment in a reverse commute situation out into these various other areas, so everybody isn't having to try to get on BART or Caltrain and always come into San Francisco, so that these employment areas are very important to them for a reverse commute, but the employment areas, all of them are being more successful by adding residential development within them. None can be a bigger example that in Dublin and Pleasanton, if you drive 580 and you're never driving it fast, you're always driving it slow so you can take your time and look around because it's always jammed with traffic. But Dublin has housing on their side of the freeway, and for years Hacienda Business Park was on their side of the freeway. They are now incorporating housing after they wouldn't put any housing into Hacienda Business Park for 30 years. They're now incorporating housing into it to balance the transportation program within their community so that they have more people that are living near the BART, near the office spaces, near the office buildings, and they're blending those two uses in a stronger way within the same office park. So if you look at all of these different communities, the lessons learned are also that they're sizing them so that they get grocery stores and services. So that if you have too few residential units, you don't get the retail that you need to help support them and all the other supportive uses that you need, both for the employees and the residents. They work with the peak period traffic through internal capture and road capacity so that you get double duty on the roads so you don't have to create them additionally wider. And the community actually supported the changes both to reduce the stress on their existing towns. That was Mountain View's story. Pleasanton wanted to attract better businesses. They needed more housing because their workers were commuting from Turlock. And that was what was jamming up 580. South Fremont was trying to have an innovation district. They were trying to attract employers. They have for 30 years tried to attract innovative employers to this area, and all they get is tilt-up buildings. And the reason is that they don't have the employees and the environment that will attract the types of employers that they want. So they're working to blend that together. And North Concord and other BART stations are looking at reverse commute and to create some employment nodes outside of the core areas and have a reverse commute in some instances, but also, again, to create that community identity. So my concern would be mostly that if you that you will have to find your own decision and the way that you want to do the overall your overall development of your community, but some of these long-standing policies that have been in place throughout the Bay Area are being changed because they realize the name of the game has changed. It's competition to get those unique businesses that you want, the unique employment that you want to see come to your community. And so it's better to plan for the growth, get your priorities as part of the community plan, and whether it's environmental sustainability or the services or the open space or the recreation or the schools and the shops that you desire, make sure that those are as important as whether or not you are just thinking of employment and businesses. And you need to think of this as a little bit of a competition because that's the way the employment is going now. They're going to the places that are trying to create the kinds of identity and community that they are looking to move into. You have a fantastic opportunity here, and I hope that you think about this as a long-term process because you've already been planning it. The reality is it's a 50-year build-out or a 75-year build-out. It isn't going to happen in my lifetime, and it's not going to happen in your lifetime. But you need to set the stage, and then each group each part of your community over time will add and allow it to be flexible, that people can change and tweak it over time, and think about that as you're moving forward in this great adventure of yours. And with that,
Thanks, Rick. Thank you. Yep, all right, great. Thank you so much. So moving on to site remediation.
you can just
I guess,
click
oh,
it.
I do.
There it
Okay,
is.
there we go. Thank you. For some reason, I thought someone else was going to bring it up. All right, great. So as was mentioned before, I'm Sarah Seelaw from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. I'm very fortunate to be here tonight with Marcus Niebank, who is a very experienced redevelopment practitioner from the city of Emeryville, or rather has worked extensively in the city of Emeryville. I'd like to start a little bit by talking about uncertainty, because it's really inherent in anything that we do in life, but I think it applies especially to redevelopment. Some of us might remember this quote from a couple of years ago about unknown unknowns. The reality is that uncertainty is an inherent part of any redevelopment project, and it's not unusual for there to be as many unknowns as there might be knowns. And that can be frightening, it can be off-putting, it can cause some anxiety. But one of the things that I really want to stress is that at this point, we as a society, we as citizens and as cities have been redeveloping sites long enough to be able to put some parameters around what is unknown in order to help us move forward. And a lot of that relates to, it's all bound up in economics. So I think Josiah said earlier that development is the economic engine that drives innovations like water reclamation and all of these exciting green innovations that we really want to incorporate into our communities. And of course, and development is only possible if we remediate first. What pays for the remediation? It's the development that takes place. So it really, we can see from the very beginning that this is a very tightly wound system. Everything is interconnected. It's kind of its own little ecosystem. In a way. And of course, the other factor here, to go one level deeper, is that end use, drives cleanup. So if we have a very passive use, for example, a solar farm or a large open space, the cleanup standards are going to be very different than if we're building for commercial or mixed use or residential. And as we move up that chain toward greater exposure, more time on the site, we arrive at more stringent cleanup standards. So, for example, in the state of California, residential is the strictest level of cleanup that we have. So, I just want to lay that out and make that very clear. It's interesting to think in the context of uncertainty about electricity, and this was a great metaphor, and I want to give Marcus due credit for bringing this up, but I think that it really works here. So if you look at this plug on the screen, we all have these in our homes, in our offices. Every single day we probably plug something in or remove something. And what's behind that panel, of course, is something that is powerful enough to finish any one of us instantly if it were to go wrong, right? And once upon a time, cords would fray, and accidents with electricity were a lot more common than they are now. I mean, think about Benjamin Franklin, right, and his famous experiment flying the kite in the lightning storm. And down at the bottom is Elon Musk, right? So we've really evolved as a society in terms of our understanding of a really powerful force like electricity. We have managed to clarify some of the unknowns about electricity. We've managed to resolve some of the uncertainties. And in the process, we've become a whole lot more comfortable with it. I would bet that most of us don't really think too much when we plug something into the wall or take it out. And I think the same can be said for when we think about remediation, right? That there's a process that we go through to understand it and to think critically about it. But then there have been so many advances in science and technology, even since we started remediating sites, say in the 1970s. Those are some of the earliest in the modern era. That we really are looking at a comparison going from the 70s up to the present day that is maybe not unlike looking at Ben Franklin compared to Elon Musk and their different relationships with energy. So I wanted to set the scene there, and my purpose here is to also give us some a little bit of perspective. We've been very focused on the Baylands and on the region, and I want to kind of move us out a little bit. This is De Kuyvel. It's a site in North Amsterdam, which is a formerly industrial area. It's receiving a lot of new development. A lot of people are moving to North Amsterdam because it's affordable, and in some ways it's the only places that Amsterdam can grow. And as we were talking earlier, I think Rick had mentioned buildings that can move up and down with tides and with sea level change. I was thinking to myself how interesting, because I remember reading about those in the context of the Netherlands. And just this morning, I got a push notice on my phone from the New York Times, and it said something like, the Dutch are used to being waterlogged, and they're willing to sell that knowledge for a price. So it was really appropriate, of course, to come here tonight and talk about De Kuyvel. I'm not going to read you the quote, but the point that I want to make about De Kuyvel is that just as we as citizens, we as local leaders, or as scientists, whatever our role may be, approach a redevelopment situation and a remediation situation, and we try to understand, we try to figure out the known knowns and the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns. We have different regimes for dealing with those, right? So we have in California and in the United States a very specific set of regulations that guide redevelopment, a very specific regulatory process that includes ample opportunities for community engagement. And I know Marcus is going to talk more about some of that in detail. But I thought De Kuyvel was an interesting example because here you have a site that's a former industrial use. It's contaminated with petroleum, and a local group went out and bought some houseboats. Some of them I think they got for free, some they purchased for $1, and plunked them down on this land. And you can see here that we've got a couple of catwalks that are suspended 3 feet above the soil, and phytoremediation is taking place. That soil is still contaminated. There are plants that are working to break down the petroleum products that are in and on the soil. But De Kuyvel is a lively, functioning, well-functioning place. There are cafes and concerts, and it's called a clean tech playground, which I think is a great term. And so it buzzes with activity day and night while the remediation goes on. This is something that in the Netherlands, the regulators and the people who are using the site and designing the site have all decided this is fine with them. This is how they choose to manage the risks and the unknown unknowns and all of those good things. But I think that it's just useful sometimes to zoom out and remind ourselves that people all around the world are dealing with these conversations about reuse. Like Rick said, it's not just here in Brisbane. This is happening throughout the region and also in many different countries. And we don't always approach it differently, and that's fine. That's a decision that we make with our elected representatives, right? This is how the Dutch have chosen to manage risk. In the United States, we have a very different way to do it. But I think that it's important just to understand the span of options and approaches that are out there, and how other communities have chosen to deal with some of the inherent unknowns of the remediation process, and to move through it and come up with some really exciting and innovative sites that are very additive to their communities at the end of the day. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Marcus to bring us back to the Bay Area and talk a little more specifically about our neighbor to the north, Emeryville.
It's 9:30. I'm going to be brief.
20.
9:20. There it is. What's that?
Push the button right there.
How's that? Thank you. Thank you. I've been practicing as an environmental and redevelopment consultant for the last 17 years. In the 13 years before that, I was a more traditional consultant, serving people with regulatory compliance problems as they struggled with their own contamination to comply with the rules and the laws in California. The last 17 years, I've been practicing on my own, which, aside from not knowing where your next paycheck is going to come from, is exciting, and it gives me opportunities to do things that I would not have had if I was with a more traditional firm. One of the opportunities was to work with the city of Emeryville for 3 years. I was their contracted full-time office in City Hall, Brownfield program manager. And they approached me. It was a tremendous honor. But I learned so much about how cities function with surplus, environmentally impaired real estate assets that I really would not have had the opportunity to learn without being inside for those 3 years. When Sarah asked me to come here tonight, we talked about the different things that I might be able to bring and share with you. And my experiences in Emeryville seemed the most appropriate because Emeryville in many ways is similar to Brisbane with respect to its geography and some of the history of the land that is contemplated to be occupied by what you folks are talking about tonight. I'm going to talk about two project examples in a moment. But first, I just wanted to summarize briefly Emeryville's circumstance and objective, and then their priorities and approach. Emeryville in the post-World War II years grew up as an industrial center in the Bay Area. In the 1980s, because of cost of labor and foreign competition, a lot of the big industries, and they were big industries, big steel plants and paint factories, just left. They didn't sell their land, but they did abandon their property. And some of you might have been around and remembered what Emeryville looked like, or you watched Harold and Maude and saw it in the movie. If you just traveled by freeway, if you looked to the east as you went down Interstate 80, you would see all these just hulks of old buildings. And Emeryville was a small town. At that time, they only had 5,000 residents. But they had a really engaged city council, and they were able to accomplish things that, quite frankly, would be very, very difficult, I think, for many entities to accomplish. And what they started, private sector development, has continued, and now Emeryville is almost completely built out. The city of Emeryville in the 90s worked to assemble some of the smaller parcels into larger developable parcels, and motivated the remediation of those parcels by leveraging what was called the Polanco Act at the time, that went away when redevelopment agencies went away. And by doing that, the city had firsthand experience with remediation. They were very involved in the decision-making process. They recognized how important partnership with regulatory agencies was to ensure that their priorities were delivered. And just briefly on the lower left-hand side of the slide, the number one priority for Emeryville was reliable and demonstrably safe cleanup. Nobody wanted to make a decision that was going to sacrifice or impair future owners, occupants, visitors of the properties. And because of those priorities, they got deeper into the weeds and developed a different kind of understanding than they might have otherwise, where they would just leave it to the whims and the desires of the developer. The development of appropriate cleanup standards and remedial goals. Sarah just talked about the standards and how different levels of cleanup are motivated by different kinds of development. The three things with respect to appropriate cleanup goals and standards that Emeryville thought were most important was, demonstrably and durably safe. The monitoring plan associated with the development needed to be sufficiently rigorous so that they would be able to predictably detect any system upsets or failures that happened in the future. And the relative permanence of the development also factored into the decision-making process, something that was going to be built and exist for a long time, especially in a situation where waste was going to be left in place. The site wasn't going to be completely cleaned before the development occurred. The longer the term and the more durable the nature of the development, the more comfortable the city was with allowing those residual materials to stay in the ground, as opposed to something that was only going to be there for 5 years and somebody else was going to come come along later, and you couldn't predict what they were going to do. The accommodating in-place solutions when appropriate was important to the city for three reasons. One is that when you take materials off-site, you have to take them off-site by truck. And the larger the site, the greater the number of truck trips. And it essentially just relocated an existing insult to the environment, but in the process added another insult through the hundreds or thousands of truck trips that it would take to move the waste from where it is, where it potentially could be safely managed in place, to somebody else's backyard. The relocation of the waste to somebody else's backyard was also something that was not high on the list of the things that the city wanted to do. So if there was a way, again, demonstrably, durably, predictably safe way to manage residual material in place instead of taking it to somebody else's backyard, the city preferred to do that. Now let's move into a couple of those examples. This is I don't know the date of the map in the lower left-hand corner. I believe it was in the early 1900s. The topo map in the upper right is the 1990s. The arrow points to the Union Pacific corridor, just to give you a sense, and it's probably easier to see up there. You can see in the lower left-hand side, in the beginning of the 1900s, the railroad ran essentially along the edge of the bay. And then in 1995, the rail line didn't relocate. All of the land to the west of the rail line is land that was filled. The aquatic park that's north of that right-hand arrow, that's the original bay margin. So you can see in Emeryville is where that arrow ends up. Half of the landward piece of the city is 1.2 square miles. So probably a third of that is built on land that was formerly water. The project that I'm going to show you, or talk about in a moment, is the Emeryville Public Market. The UP rail line is just to the right of the yellow outline of the public market. So it's built almost entirely on land that was once water. This is the Emeryville shoreline, 1944. The buildings the structures that you see in the central part of that flat expanse. That is the old Paraffin Roofing Materials Company. That was the first company to exist on that land, and much of the land to the north and to the south of it was filled by that company, and it was filled with their waste materials from their roofing manufacturing process. So all of that land, virtually all of that land, is either known to contain heavy oils, heavy metals, pieces of asphalt roofing, just tar. It's nasty dirt, and it's now this is that land now. So all of the development that you see in this area, there it is, up there, was built on land that was filled by the Paraffin Roofing Company. That doesn't work. So this is a picture of a schematic of a redevelopment vision that is currently being implemented at the public market. It was first built out in 1989, and some of you may have visited that property, over the years since. And it was kind of an adaptive redevelopment. There are some old paraffin buildings that are still there. Many of the others have been removed and replaced by an office building and some shops. A movie theater used to exist there. When they first built it in the late 80s, they built it engaged with the Department of Toxic Substances Control was the oversight agency, and the city of Emeryville. We all worked together. That wasn't when I was there. I would have liked to have been there when they did it. But the decisions that they made involved some small removal actions, but mainly mainly the material that had been put in place stayed in place, and the remedial measure that the developer deployed was essentially a cap on the site, and the cap consisted of the buildings and the roadways, the asphalt surfaces. There is a small park here. That's actually, this is the park, and it's going to be expanded into this area in the next phase of development. That was separated from the materials underneath by adding about 8 feet of clean soil. So there's no way that a park visitor or occupant could come in contact with the materials that remained there. When the development was completed in the 80s, or in association with its deployment, the developer, working with the city and the regulator, prepared what's known as a site management plan. And that site management plan attaches to a deed restriction. The purpose of the deed restriction is to notify future owners, developers, occupants that this property contains an environmental impairment, but it references and includes the site management plan, which describes how anybody that wants to do anything on that land at some point in the future needs to go about doing it. This schematic that you see here for the redevelopment and the densification of the marketplace and its surrounding environment has gone back to that site management plan, and this is probably the only example that I know of where 2 stages of development separated by 25 years have occurred. I mean, people will tell you, these things work. We make a plan, we make a deed restriction, and its intention is to notify somebody in the future so that they're not going to run into problems when they want to do something. But I've never seen that second phase actually come to pass. You just expect it to come to pass. And this is an instance where it did. And I'm familiar with what they're doing now. The site management plan has been modified and updated, but all of the protections and the triggers that were incorporated into that plan to guide future development and to prevent mistakes and mishaps from occurring actually worked. So it's nice to see one go the way that it's supposed to go. The second example is not on filled land. It's on the other side of the filled land. The public market is to the left of that yellow square, yellow rectangle. This is the former Westinghouse Transformer Rehabilitation Center that existed. I don't know the acreage. It's probably about a 3 to 4 acre parcel. On the lower right-hand side, you can kind of see a side of it. The long building that you see is the same building that's in the lower left-hand corner of the slide. What Westinghouse did was receive transformers by rail, refurbish them, and then redeploy them for sale or for use. In the process, they contaminated that entire 3 to 4 acre parcel with PCBs and heavy metals, and it was a very, very contaminated site. It was the building in the lower left-hand corner was damaged in the Loma Prieta earthquake, and their operations ceased, and they relocated. They didn't leave for the reasons that other people left, but they did still leave. This entire, say, 3 acres was redeveloped by Wareham, and some of you probably have gone out of the Amtrak station that's in Emeryville. That would have been in the lower left-hand corner of that square is where the Amtrak station is. Actually, I'm sorry, it's in the center of the rectangles where the Amtrak station is. But around it are multi-story residential buildings and 2 office buildings. And the way Wareham built on this property, when they did this construction in the mid-1990s, the Amtrak station was the last thing that was built, is they took all of the waste from the areas on the lower left-hand side and then the upper right side. They scraped the soil that contained the PCB contamination, and they put it all in the parcel on the upper left-hand corner, and they covered it. And they covered it with a parking lot. And that parking lot for the Amtrak station was called the mound parcel by the city of Emeryville because it was a big mound. but nobody that parked there knew that they were parking on top of high concentration PCB contaminated waste. That's the mound parcel on the left-hand side. On the right is what Wareham is now in the process of building. When they got to the point, by developing the other 3 parcels first, they were able to make, and with some serious assistance of EPA grant funding, they were able to make the remediation of the mound parcel pencil. But what they did was they removed the upper 3 feet of material, and that had to go away. There was no way you could manage it on site. But there was 8 more feet below that of PCB contaminated soil. They incorporated a rigorous engineering control into the foundation of the transit center. That's what this building is going to be. It's going to be transit on the bottom and offices on the top. A vapor recovery system, an impermeable barrier. There's absolutely no way that anybody in this building is ever going to come in contact with what's underneath the surface, the floor of the foundation of this transit center. But 3/4 of the waste from the entire property is entombed beneath this building, and it's going to be entombed beneath this building forever. There's nothing else really to say about Westinghouse. I guess the purpose for bringing these 2 examples is just to describe the way that particular city, and working in partnership with the regulators and the developers, was able to cure something that I think in other places would be sufficiently daunting to motivate folks to develop somewhere else. But the technology exists, the understanding exists. If you want to go back to Sarah's analogy, maybe Love Canal and some of the other really horrible American disasters as far as they associate with it, post-industrial contamination, Love Canal could be Ben Franklin, when electricity was being discovered. That's when we as Americans first, or the world perhaps, first came to understand what our post-industrial legacy now consisted of in the way of challenges to, what would be life otherwise as usual. We've come a long way since then, and with the proper partnerships, with the right kind of engagement, city staff engagement, the assistance of retained consultants, a project can be delivered safely today in a way that it couldn't have been 25 years ago. So I'll just stop because it's late, and maybe you have
Great.
questions.
Thanks. I'm sure there are questions about both of these topics, so let's take a few, see where it goes. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Paul Buscal from Brisbane. So I had asked a question over the years about, a big reason why, aside from the traffic, the housing is an issue for many members of the community is because of the contamination on the site. So I'm not talking, are you all familiar with the logistics of the site? How one side of Tunnel Road is an unregulated landfill and the other side was a rail yard. So I'm talking about the rail yard. The mitigated measures haven't been proven for as many years as it's been talked about as far as the caps, especially in an area prone to liquefaction. And so one of the thoughts I had was, could we take the contaminants from the railroad site on a conveyor and put it over on the unregulated landfill? And the question was asked by members of the council, and the response was that it's possible, but the regulatory issue could be a sticky point. So my thought, and to your comments about hauling it off site, and one of the consultants that we had, Mr. Zola, said that there are risks. is, like you mentioned, running these truck trips through other neighborhoods. So is it possible, rather than remediation, to do a real cleanup and put that stuff over on the unregulated landfill?
Sure, no, absolutely. I believe so, yes. And there's examples. The Westinghouse site is a good example of temporary relocation of waste. There's in Oakland, south of the Park Street Bridge, is a park, a shoreline park, that was heavily contaminated with lead and soil, and the city of Oakland didn't have the money to take the dirt to a landfill, and what they did was they built a kind of looks like a conning tower on a submarine, but much bigger, a container, and they scraped the site and they put the dirt in the container and they entombed it on site. The relocation of waste within a parcel is easier than the relocation of a waste from one parcel to another, but it's not impossible. And if you're working with a regulatory agency, again in partnership, who wants to motivate cleanup, and one way to motivate it would be to permit relocation of and safe management of waste in a manner such as you describe, I don't see why you couldn't engage and have a serious conversation about that.
Ask a couple questions. Thank you for your presentations. I'll start the first one with Rick. You talked about creating a community, and our sustainability framework is modeled after the One Planet Living 10 principles. Perhaps that might be a direction the council goes. Trying to create a One Planet community. You talked about being competitive and, to get those infrastructure dollars for transportation. A lot of it's tied to transit-oriented development. So, in regards to housing, there's a lot of talk right now in regards to workforce housing. Are you aware of any types of zoning where the cities are requiring the commercial build out to have a housing component of workforce housing as a part of the overall development, so that you are ensuring that the housing that's going to be built is going to be affordable, is going to be used for the employees of a particular commercial site?
Currently in Mountain View, and they've been doing a lot of analysis on this, they have a couple of different strategies that they have. They're, number one, they understand that the workforce in the North Bay Shore is, though it's wide, they have a number of, they have a lot of young tech workers. They have a lot of people that are single or couples. So what they've done is they've set up the densities and the building types and the unit mixes so that they are encouraging smaller units. They're encouraging a higher proportion of small units than larger units. They are requiring densities that are higher. And then the other thing they're doing is they're having very low parking ratios. And actually the parking ratio, by being lower, you had mentioned that parking is an expensive item to put in the development, is actually helping bring down the cost of the housing so that there's and you'll see that reflected in the price, in the rents. They also are looking at different technologies during construction. In fact, we were reading just today, Google is purchasing 300 modular units that they are looking at, because this is a test case for them to, and they're basically doing small studio units that are going to be built modularly off-site and brought on-site as part of a housing development. And so it's the size of the unit, keeps the cost down. There's a variety of other types of housing styles that are coming back in, where multiple units that have their own small mini apartment, their own bathroom, but have a shared living room among multiple units is
more
coming
communal,
back into place.
Yeah, so more communal type of.
Right, a little more communal. And actually, a lot of the younger generation, the new generation of workforce is actually, that's a very appealing way of living for them. And so they're looking at those models. But the council is actually, and the planning commission are the ones that are pushing these agendas. Mm-hmm. And they are asking for the higher density, the lower parking ratios. They don't want to encourage the car ownership. And then they're also building into the streets zones, loading zones and everything, because they're anticipating a lot of use by Lyft and Uber and all the other vehicles, because the folks aren't going to all have their own vehicles. So they're setting up a whole system in the design of the community that will support not owning a car or having a very low car ownership. So that is being done within the Mountain View Community Plan as we speak, and should be, it's in the process of going through the approvals by the fall.
Menlo Park is another example where Facebook is building 1,500 units on its existing parking lots that will be more like dorm style, and in addition contributing to 3,000 units that are part of the city but adjacent to Facebook. And it's not only for the tech workers, but rather for also for the affordable component, people who are working as janitors and in the kitchen and cafes, and so it's a mix from very low income to higher income, but similar to Menlo Park or as Mountain View.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that they also have a percentage of affordability on top of all the other elements that I discussed, so that because they do understand that not everybody makes a Google salary or a Facebook salary. There's a huge support service economy, and they don't want all of those people always to have to be driving into the community as well, because for them, they want to see the development happen, and they want to see the business attraction, and they want to see the employment, but they only have one or two ways in and out of a community that already has millions and millions and millions and millions of square feet of office. And development on the site, and more in the future. So they are literally constricted by the roadway network and by their TDM program. They can only allow a certain number of square feet of employment uses to occur, and so they are it's literally their roadway is just a constricting device that prevents them from having additional development there.
Okay, yeah,
they're working every way to get that expanded.
Thank you for providing those examples of those two cities. Yeah, I'm a board member of Commute.org, and one of the things that we were talking about today is that generation of employees, and they're buying less stuff than folks like me, and
And
the
sharing
30
more.
and 40-year-olds, right? And but they're spending their money on experiences, right? It's like, hey, I want to enjoy my life rather than collect a lot of things. I mean, and so there you go, and you don't need the larger living space to load it up with a bunch of stuff. And then Sarah, you mentioned the site in North Amsterdam, and during one of our meetings, our Baylands EIR hearing meetings, we talked about remediation, of course, and we brought up the Dutch standard. And so here's this place in North Amsterdam. How is the Dutch standard different than the Cal EPA standards?
So, good question. I am, is that something that I'd actually prefer to get back to you on, because I know about the De Koivel site. I'm not an expert on the Dutch remediation standards, and so I wouldn't want to get into a
Sure.
very technical discussion of those standards and give you incorrect information. But that's definitely something that I'd be happy to follow up on.
That would be great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
More questions? These were the two favorite topics that we all wanted to have on this panel, so there's got to be one more question.
I'll just say one thing
Yeah.
So we were hired by the city of San Francisco to create the plan for the Schlage Lock plant. It had a lot of people talking about it, so we were working for the city to build a set of regulations and do a plan with the community there in Visitation Valley. And one of the criteria that the community, in wanting the change from the Schlage Lock plant, was, and what the city wanted, was eventually they knew that whole entire site would have to be remediated and do some semblance of cleanup. And so the plan actually had to have a lot of factors built into it where we had to determine what grading, with the hot spots that were known, what grading and what land uses would go in what places, what would be capped how, and if residential development particularly was going to occur, they wanted a separation between the residential and the soil, and so there was a whole strategy within the whole plan and the building types and everything that was set up around creating that. And eventually it turned into a master cleanup plan that was independent of the master plan, but as part of the criteria, a master cleanup plan that was also linked to a major insurance policy that ensured that cleanup would occur at a certain level that allowed for residential development. So those two, but the plans and the zoning and the regulations and the parking and the building types weren't two independent things. They were both thought of strategically, just like they were in Emeryville, that you had to think about the land uses, how long people were going to be there, the type of cleanup that was needed for each particular area. And a couple of areas, because of the great concern, they said, well, we aren't sure we really want residential development in those areas. So if it couldn't be cleaned up to that level, it was changed to a different land use depending on whether or not they could achieve the cleanup level that they needed to achieve for residential development. There could be just commercial development. Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking of the planning and the land uses and everything, you want to think about those things very integrated and understand that there is a strategy for doing that and a process for doing it. And I mean, that was I heard a $30 million ticket item to just deal with those 20 acres, which actually at today's land value seems cheap. But so think about those things together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A question over here.
Is this on, Ingrid? Okay. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Danny Ames, and I live in Brisbane for several decades. I was just wondering, is anybody familiar with Paul Stamets' work or his book, Mycelium Running, and using fungi to remediate soil contamination and the practicality of that? I don't know what kind of a toxic soup we have out there, but I'm hearing like either you take the soil out, and then is the soil being relocated to be processed to be clean, or is it being relocated to be entombed in perpetuity? And it seems to me it'd be more practical to deal with it at the site, but are there cost constraints based on the soup of the contaminant doesn't make it worth it? Can the site be remediated, completely there? I mean, I don't like the idea of hundreds of thousands of truck trips in and out of an area. I mean, my fantasy thing would be is a solar farm, that energy helps remediate the soil in combination with using techniques like Paul Stamets has suggested. So one is a question of practicality with that for anybody. And then I have another question way off base, but does anybody know on these floating structures, how tall of a building can you have that can float? I mean, today I heard of a Texas-sized iceberg now about to break off. So, I think there's going to be accelerated ocean rising. So that'd be a fascinating answer I'd like to hear if you have it. How tall of a structure can you have float? Anybody know what the tallest structure is on the planet?
I can honestly say I have no idea.
Wouldn't it just be the ratio of the base to the height of the structure?
Oh, I don't know. I think you'd.
So
Might
and
need
then
to be
you
an
can answer
engineer
the
involved.
contamination one.
Yeah.
Because I answered that floating. It
talk about
depends.
fungi.
It depends on the contaminants. Some contaminants, like metals, you're not going to lower the concentration. You can consolidate them, but most often, if you want the property to be free of soil that contains metals, you're going to have to take that soil someplace else. If it's an organic contaminant, a petroleum contaminant, for instance, you can remediate that on site. You can break it down. Fungi would take a very long time. There are ways to accelerate that. So if you have room, the technology exists to treat soil on site. Usually when it's taken off site, it goes to a landfill, and usually the landfill will just use it for daily cover. That's what landfills do with petroleum contaminated soil.
I'd like to add one more thing. So we have a series of educational webinars that we're hosting, and we actually have one coming up on July 12th called When Life Hands You a Landfill. And it's all about landfill remediation. And then later in the fall, I believe it's in September, but I'd have to check, we have a webinar focused on phyto and myco remediation. So if you're interested, please come see me. I'll give you my card and make sure that you get that information.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much for the information on what the other cities have been doing, and I thought that was really interesting to hear about the competitive advantage that to build that cities are doing to build residential to attract the commercial, and what that's like from a commercial developer's perspective. My question is though, the housing issue in Brisbane is particularly sensitive given our small size. And the balance of, more than, the possibility of more than doubling, almost tripling our population is something that scares a lot of people here about how do we then retain and enhance that community identity. So you gave the example of Emeryville, which has a population of 5,000 people. So, and I don't know what the scale was of residential development there, but do you have any examples of other similarly small residential communities that have added significant amounts of housing or housing in general, and how that has impacted their character, and whether they and what tools they use to retain that character through even despite development?
You would know better than I.
Yeah. So I'll just say that Emeryville has added thousands and thousands and thousands of units over the last.
It doubled.
Yeah.
It doubled in the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it went from 5,000 to 10,000.
But and I'll just add then, because I don't know of any place else, but Emeryville, it was separate. So the character of older residential Emeryville is still today what it was then, and it's married well. I don't see any conflict or interference. The newer residential developments that are on the old industrial property, they're complementary. They're separate neighborhoods to a degree, but there's a border zone that is porous, so they get along. But it was a doubling, but it was a doubling in two different places.
You're right, and with different character and different populations and everything like that. I think that actually something you all should think about. The Baylands is a big animal. It's going to occur over a long period of time. It's not going to. You don't get to snap your fingers and it just happens, and it won't be built out in most of our lifetimes. But one of the things that you should really be thinking about is what is the plan you want for your existing community. and think about that. How do you want it to change or benefit from whatever development occurs on the other side of the road? And think about the enhancing of your downtown community. Do you want more commercial to be in that area? What do you want to happen to the tilt-up warehouses that are over on this side of the road? Do you want those to change? How do you want those to change? And what is that transition do you want? Do you just want it to sort of be a wall where on one side of the road it's the new world, and on the old side of the road it's the old world, and there's nothing in between? Or do you want that area between Bayshore Boulevard and the residential neighborhood, this kind of amalgamation of tilt-up warehouses and different commercial buildings and things that you have over in this zone? Do you want to see that transform as well? Because it will. So you should be as prepared to be thinking about what's happening in that zone, because that will probably have more impact on all the residences that are here now than the Baylands will have. You maybe won't believe that, but the reality is that if you don't have things over here that are attracting the residents from the other area, they may not come over here much. They may not be much impact at all to your small community here. And what you want to do is see what kind of benefits that you want and what kind of changes do you want to see, and really control those. And I think you have the ability to enhance what you have, which is this kind of cute, cool, little bit different, off the beaten path area, that there will be a market for that type of development. Everybody doesn't want to live in a new residential building with a new office. They want to live in these old warehouses, or work in an old warehouse that you saw the examples of how those changed in a green, sustainable way too. It's not all about the Baylands. It's really about what is your community going to be, and is there going to be more retail in your little downtown? Do you want to have your farmers market attract people from outside, from the Baylands over to here? Do you want to have more energy in downtown, or do you want it to remain kind of quiet and relatively sleepy? And that's an okay way to be. It's okay to be that way. But I think that you should spend as much time focusing on that as you do on what the Baylands will become, because I think it will impact your lives substantially more than the Baylands will in how it evolves and how you get the changes. And those are going to be other benefits that you're going to see in real world time as you see those things taking place. So that, to me, is actually the interesting part of Brisbane from my perspective. It's kind of cool, it's kind of different, you get to connect to an existing community. People want that too. And you want to attract the people that want to be connected to Brisbane, that have the same feeling that you want it to have. And that is the much more important immediate question. And I think that you can take the benefits of a Baylands development and apply those benefits to your existing community, and it can kind of happen. And this is what you can really have that is really going to be a special place. And I would think a little bit more about that. And I'm not saying to worry less about the Baylands, but focus a little more attention on how your community, how you want it to change when it gets a little more energy and a little bit more vibrancy, and you want it to be small streets and all of those things that you are really focusing a lot of energy on over there. Well, you kind of would like to have a little bit of some of that over here too. And I think that would be the thing that I would think about the most.
Thank you. I was noticing some people yawning out there, but so if there is one last burning question, perhaps we can entertain it. But I want to thank the panel for staying for an additional half an hour. But go ahead. Question?
Thank you, Ingrid. So I'm going to prune my questions here in the sense that, for everybody's sanity here. So you said that Baylands is similar to Emeryville in some ways, and I'm wondering if Emeryville was in fact an unlined, unregulated dump, as the Baylands was, and you said it was dissimilar in other ways, and I'm wondering what ways it was dissimilar in.
I don't know if so to the latter. I think there's more in terms of its industrial history. It differs because it had steel plants and paint factories, and you didn't have those here. You had some, but I don't think the industrial development wasn't quite to the degree that it was really concentrated up there. The Bay fill that Public Market is built on and the Watergate apartment tower is built on was all completely unlined and unregulated. And most of the waste that's in there, the waste that looks like roofing material and smells like heavy oil, folks are pretty sure came from the Paraffin Roofing Company. Much of the other material nobody can document. It was completely undocumented. It was filled in the 40s and the 50s with stuff that came probably from the heavy industry, but which ones and where it went, nobody really knows. That's why whenever they work out there, they characterize it to the best of their abilities, but they know the most important component of the remediation associated with the development is the prophylactic, is the protective measure that they deploy, because they know they're never going to be able to understand the whole thing, but they do know that they've got the ability to protect folks against whatever it is that exists inside it.
Okay, good. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for sticking around this long too, but also thank the panel for coming out. And I hope this was a valuable experience for you in your process and your journey in looking at the project. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.